Coming up this week on Breaking Badness, today we discuss VPN bug me. Chinese APT uses VPN bug to exploit worldwide operational technology organizations. Next up, stop the wall bleeding. We're talking about wall bleed, a buffer overread vulnerability that existed in the DNS injection subsystem of the Great Firewall of China. And of course, our game, Gold and Guidances, as we are a little tired of sharing grievances. With that, Breaking Badness is next. Welcome to Breaking Badness, episode number 203, recorded on March 3rd, 2025. I'm your co-host, Callie, snug as a VPN bug in a rug fensel. With me is co-host Tim. You down with pwned OT? No, not me. Tell me. And last but not least, Taylor. Nobody makes me wall bleed my own wall blood. Wilkes Pierce. Very good, everybody.
Nailed it, Callie.
Excellent, Daves. How has everybody been doing?
Good.
So great.
We should talk about some InfoSec. I think that's why the people are here. So to start, we are going to talk about VPN bug me. So a Chinese APT is using a VPN bug to exploit worldwide operational technology organizations and operational technology, also known as OT. So Tim, can you give us an overview of the recent cyber espionage campaign involving Chinese APT 41 and the VPN vulnerability?
Yes, I can certainly do that. So APT 41 goes by a number of different names, as so many of these APT groups do. Windtie, Double Dragon, Barium, I think are the main ones that I've seen. And they are a pretty prolific espionage group. They've been linked to a number of high-profile attacks. They've compromised, at least, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, they've compromised at least 100 companies worldwide. They do all the usual techniques of spear phishing, malware, supply chain attacks. They got some notoriety. I think it was roughly in the last summer timeframe for some somewhat clever Android malware as well. They are exploiting a bug that we'll talk about in a second that has had the bug has affected a lot of devices worldwide. Hopefully fewer now because patch has been out for a while. This is a group that has a pretty wide reach. It makes sense that we're seeing some attention to this latest campaign that they seem to be mounting.
For sure. What would you say the significance of CVE 2024-24919 vulnerability in checkpoint security gateways would be?
Okay, now say it 3 times in a row and backwards.
Oh my gosh. Say it 3 times in a row.
Yeah. So this bug affects various devices from Checkpoint that are, and it's a bug, as you said, it's a VPN bug. So specifically, these are devices that run IPsec, which is a flavor of encrypted VPN tunnel. It's actually a very old one. IPsec's been around for decades now, but it is still, at least if it's a relatively recent implementation, IPsec itself is relatively secure. The problem here is that with this bug, it was found that with a specially crafted request into the VPN device, then even unauthenticated attacker could access directories and files that they're not supposed to be able to access. Now, here's the rub. You can't really have a VPN device that's not exposed to the internet, or it won't do the thing. The whole point is you're creating an encrypted secure connection from one place on the internet to another. By definition, this is not like some devices where we can give the advice not to expose it on the internet. The whole point of a VPN concentrator or VPN endpoint is that it has to be exposed on the internet. That's where any sort of compromise is a big deal, whether it is a vulnerability like this one, which has long been patched by Checkpoint. I'll emphasize that a couple times, or whether it is using weak passwords and that kind of thing, or not using multi-factor authentication when that is available. Those are the kinds of things that can get you in trouble because you have no choice but to have these endpoints exposed to the internet. So the significance of this vulnerability is Check Point's a very popular vendor, and they make really good stuff. At this point, I can't think of really any major security vendor that hasn't had a bug here or there, and sometimes fairly significant ones. It just sooner or later, it happens to everybody. Software is complex. This kind of software is immensely complex, and the appliances and so forth that it runs on, and the stakes are very high. So there was a study that Gray Noise did, I think, last summer, where they found that close to 800 different IP addresses were observed attempting to exploit this. And at the same time, a census scan was showing, I don't know, 13,000 or something, if memory serves, devices that were out there that were not patched yet. Now, that was as of like last June of 2024. So hopefully the vast majority of those devices have been patched by this point. But as this story we're talking about today proves, not all of them have.
Why do you think that OT organizations are particularly attractive targets for cyber espionage?
Yeah, so if you think about, OT, operational technology, that's where we're thinking about process automation and manufacturing and stuff like that. And in this case, aerospace has been highlighted as one of the industries involved. Where you've got aerospace, very often you've got defense contracts, and so you've got the potential for sensitive military information to be the intellectual property that's of interest. Could it be things like intellectual property related to manufacturing fighter aircraft or something like that? Potentially. Could be industrial espionage. More. China has actually gotten into the commercial aircraft market in a fairly significant way in the last couple of decades. So it's possible that some of it is industrial espionage like that, but I think we should more assume geopolitical type motives. So these are companies that have very sensitive intellectual property, potentially, that could be valuable from an espionage perspective. And also, we're not seeing right now, we're not seeing evidence that there is compromise of actual OT devices, manufacturing processes and automation devices and stuff like that being compromised is not what we seem to be observing here right now. It's more in lines of intellectual property theft. However, it's scary anytime an unwanted intruder, and especially a well-resourced and sophisticated one, is in those kinds of environments. It's a very uncomfortable spot to be in.
Yeah, for sure. What would you say like a campaign like this reveals about the state of cybersecurity in OT environments?
All organizations at some point, at some level or another, are similar in that they have touch points on the internet, and just because you're in the manufacturing or critical infrastructure or any of the kinds of industries that we think of when we think of OT, just because you're in one of those industries doesn't mean you're magically more secure than banks and governments and retailers and all of that. Everybody's facing a lot of the same kinds of challenges when it comes to protecting yourself against well-resourced attackers, and the fact that vulnerabilities can crop up, even as I was mentioning, when you're using some of the best products on the planet. That's just going to happen from time to time. Now, we can think of a couple of things, though, that we automatically tend to think of the stakes being higher, because if critical infrastructure is disrupted by hackers, for example, that could be a very big deal. This is not that. But the other thing to think about is, while in theory, the operational environment is supposed to be air-gapped, that is, no network connectivity with the outside world, the reality is it's more complicated than that. And there usually is not an actual air gap between the enterprise environment at the so-called OT company or OT industry, which is not really a thing, but we can use it as a shorthand in this case for industries that involve manufacturing, process automation, and stuff. There is a certain amount of permeability of the separation of the OT environment and the IT or enterprise environment of those same companies themselves. But this is a little bit like, I'm reminded of the Colonial Pipeline incident a few years ago, that intrusion where the pipeline was shut down, but it wasn't because the attacker got in and actually controlled valves and so forth. They got into the IT environment of the Colonial, of that company, and the company chose to shut down the pipeline as a precautionary measure while they sorted things out. And so that sort of indirect shutdown is one of the possible outcomes when you have an intrusion into a company that does manufacturing or critical infrastructure or something like that. But again, in this case, it looks like this is more about espionage, trying to steal intellectual property, trying to steal, who knows, design documents, financial documents. We don't really know exactly what kind of stuff they're after.
I guess my final question for you would be, what are the key takeaways for cybersecurity professionals from this incident?
Yeah, I think this is where, back to the earlier point about the necessary evil of, there are certain devices that you have to expose to the internet because that's how they work. And that's where we talked last week about the idea that patch everything all the time is a nice idea, but it's not realistic. But if you're going to pick a subset of the most important things to keep patched, the things that have to be exposed to the internet by their very nature should be high on that list. And the good news about the vulnerabilities, for the most part, that we've seen with like security vendors and so forth, they tend to get patches out pretty quickly. And most of those devices have a fairly straightforward method of downloading and installing patches and updates. It's very important for them to be able to do that because they're sitting in such a critical position. Now, that's really different from, since we're talking about OT, from patching actual OT devices. That's a whole, like, that's a separate podcast. Like, not just a separate episode of Breaking Badness. Like, that's a whole other podcast, which I would listen to. But we should get Leslie Carhart to start it. If you're trying to decide in prioritizing and triaging, et cetera, where patches should be applied, things that absolutely have to be exposed to the internet are high on the list from my perspective. And then, of course, within that, doing the other things like for VPN concentrators. What happened with this, by the way, is I don't think we ever really went into exactly how this worked in these environments. But once they got into the checkpoint devices, they were then able to move laterally into things including Windows domain controllers. And if you get into a Windows Active Directory controller, you then potentially have a lot of access across the organization and potentially very high privileges. And so that was where the infiltration occurred. And at that point, the things get pretty serious pretty quickly. Now, in this case, it wasn't because somebody had weak VPN credentials with a password of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and no multi-factor. No, nobody's saying that. This was unauthenticated bypass. So that was in the nature of the vulnerability itself. That said, next time there's a compromise of a VPN at an important organization, who's to say that it won't be because weak credentials were used on the VPN? Ensuring that folks are using strong credentials for any VPN concentrator type device should be a really important part of your policy.
Thanks, Tim. I think this brings us to the hoodie rating portion of our show. If you're a newer listener, what we like to do when we talk about an article is, when we're done, assign it a hoodie rating. If you can picture a stereotypical hacker in a hoodie, from 1 to 10 hoodies, 10 being absolutely critical, to 1, which is, oh, this isn't so bad. It's more of a FYI. That's how we like to rate them. So we just heard from Tim on his analysis of the article. So Taylor, what are you thinking hoodie-wise?
It's an interesting one because obviously anytime you're breaking into someone, the kind of VPN choke point, you're going to see a lot of stuff and then be able to move laterally to a lot of places. So that's not great, but it appears to be fairly limited from a scope perspective in terms of targets. And then also seems like it's more of an espionage. It's not like they're breaking in and then burning everything down. So I'm going to go 2.67 hoodies.
Okay. Sticking with the decimal places. I like it.
How's the 2/3 of the hoodie designed?
Great question. It is actually just a massive hood part.
Oh,
you can kind of get underneath it. Yeah. It's got very little of the actual hoodie. It's a complete mess up.
Somebody hacked into their process automation in the hoodie factory.
Exactly. In the OT of the hoodie factory, they broke in using this and they got a broken hoodie, and that's what they deserve.
Yeah.
Tim, do you feel similarly?
Yeah, I'm going to put it just a little bit higher because we don't know right now how many unpatched of these checkpoint devices there still are out there in the world. And so that makes me a little nervous. I hope it's a very low number, but if there were 13,000 last summer, it ain't zero today. Let's put it that way. And the CVE got 8.6 out of 10. It's a pretty serious vulnerability. Put me down for 4.5 hoodies.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you to both of you for that. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we are going to talk about stop the wall bleeding. So stay tuned and we will be right back. All right. And we're back.
Bum, bum, bum.
How's everybody doing?
So good.
Trying to figure out how to wear that weird hoodie.
That's for APT 41. They got it.
That sounds almost a
They
little
own
like
that mess.
the all hood hoodie sounds like a ghost outfit for little kids at Halloween.
Yeah, it does.
It's got dumb little drawstrings that don't do anything though. Again, I don't want them to like it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's true. By the way, the drawstrings getting lost in the laundry or pulled into the tunnel of the hood, it's a real problem, isn't it? It's really frustrating. I always now tie knots in the drawstrings of my hoodie when I get a new hoodie. That's one of the first things I do.
That's a good idea.
Sometimes those come undone.
It can happen. Yeah. Hoodie maintenance is important.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Keep your hoodies patched, everyone.
Well, we are going to talk about our next article, which is Stop the Wall Bleeding. And wall bleed is a buffer overread vulnerability that existed in the DNS injection subsystem of the Great Firewall of China. So we're talking to Taylor about this one. Taylor, can you give us an overview of the wall bleed vulnerability and how it was discovered?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. Anytime that someone is poking around the Great Firewall, interesting findings are sure to follow. In this case, a set of researchers and academics found that the DNS mechanisms inside of the Great Firewall that allow them to do active filtering. Hey, you've requested a domain that we don't want you to go check out. That those mechanisms that do that active censorship had the ability to ask for more data than you should be able to get. And those DNS resolvers, whatever the bits of custom code that they wrote to do that type of replacement of things that they want to replace, would happily give you an extra 125 bytes of data from the DNS message you were not entitled to or supposed to get. So they noticed this in, looks like late 2021-ish, and then for a number of years poked at the resolvers inside and around the Great Firewall to leak data out of the Great Firewall about a number of things, but they gave them a little bit of access to see what was going on there.
Maybe we should back up a little bit too, and like for anybody that doesn't know,
what is the Great?
Yeah, what is it?
Yeah, so from the 90s to now, China has a pretty heavily censored version of the internet, right? So they use something they call the Great Firewall, obviously riffing off of the Great Wall of China, in order to block objectionable content that the folks in charge there would rather people not be able to access. Over the years, they've had to harden the Great Firewall. They've had to make it much larger. The internet has grown, so it's evolved. And then a pretty key component of it is a DNS resolver inside of it that they've written that then allows them to swap out things for things that that they don't want you to go to.
So what is the significance of this vulnerability in the context of the Great Firewall of China?
Yeah, so other DNS resolvers don't do this, right? Like they see a malformed request and go, yeah, I'm not going to give you extra data. But this bug has been there for a few years. These folks noticed it and poked at it from the outside for a number of years, just collecting data on the extra bits of extraneous data that were coming out. So they could see things like HTTP headers, they could see SMTP commands, they could see internal Great Firewall processes, they could see just, again, little bits of information at a time, internal stuff. They're able to identify the fake IPs that the Great Firewall gives out when you ask it for something it doesn't want you to go to. They spend a lot of time kind of poking and prodding at this thing.
And how does the buffer overread vulnerability in the DNS injection subsystem work?
Yeah, so they're calling this wall bleed. It is a take on Heartbleed, which is an SSL bug from 10 or so years ago, where if you asked for more data out of the SSH process, it would give you more about the key than you were supposed to know. So it's basically,
it's been 10 years since Heartbleed. That's scary.
I didn't want to say it. I said or so. I was just trying to buy myself some like, yeah, it's only been like 8.5, right?
Even if it's so.
I do think it was 2014. But yes, so that they call back to that bug, and it's off the Great Firewall. So it's a wall bleed. So they're leaking little bits of information over a number of years, right? So I think that's part of this is interesting because a lot of times if you found like Heartbleed, for example, that was a 10 alarm fire that basically everybody shut down to patch everything for Heartbleed, right? This is a scenario where they found an overflow that they could get data out of, but they didn't tell anybody for a couple of years and they just kept poking at it.
What information could be exposed through this vulnerability?
A number of things about the internal workings of the Great Firewall, a number of things about maybe what they might want to block or what other types of traffic are flying around. The point is there's not a ton of control. You're not getting a ton of data, but you're getting data that you're really not supposed to be taking a look at that type of scale. Reconnaissance on the internal workings of it, along with, hey, someone could potentially leak user data, requester data that's going into that system could get leaked out.
Okay. And does this say anything about the state of censorship and surveillance technologies?
I think it's telling us a lot of stuff we already knew. I think it's a little interesting to see how the censorship sausage gets made, what things are interesting about that for end users internal to China. There's probably a lot of evasion going on this stuff that we're not going to see here, but any chance that we can get to poke at the inner workings of that, it's pretty opaque. That's a lot of visibility. Hey, here's all the fake IP addresses that we give out when we don't want to give you the right answer to something. That's interesting.
Okay. So what would you say the key takeaways are from the wall bleed incident?
Check one for you should be testing your stuff better. Testing your resolvers. That's maybe the lesson that the other side, the folks implementing the Great Firewall can learn. I think understanding that it can impact stuff outside of mainland China because the requests go around and pop. So like if you are an organization that has hosted resources in China for business purposes, and you've got things that are making DNS calls, that your data could potentially have been leaked as a part of this. So I think that's something for folks to consider. But then obviously the broader impacts of how effective this is also very interesting. And then there's ethical considerations around the research in some ways. Again, these folks just will collect this data for a number of years. From their side, I get who exactly do you file the bug? Like, how do we get our bug bounty on this? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure they want to.
Yeah, but I think there's something to be said for that. Like, more nefarious actor, or these folks might not have been the only folks to find this, I guess, is something to consider.
Okay. And I know when you initially shared this with me, it is a rather large report that you shared. I don't know how many pages.
Dense.
It's very dense. And I just want to make sure this is just a summary of that report. Is there anything else that people would absolutely have to know in order, or what you would recommend they read further on in that report, because this is such a small sampling of what's in there?
The site that it's on, the gfw.report, they've been posting data about the censorship mechanisms in the Great Firewall for a number of years now. This is the latest turn in their research. There's a presentation that goes along with it that's also worth checking out. Their prior reporting is also worth checking out. And this is really new. Like this came out late last week. So we'll see. I want to hear what other luminaries in the industry have to say about. I want to hear what Renee Burton over at Infoblox has to say about the DNS mechanism inside the Great Firewall. So a lot to stay tuned on that. I think as we get everyone's read and reactions on this, I'm very interested in that.
Awesome. Yeah, Renee Burton, if you are listening, we would love to hear your thoughts. But for now, we'll have to do with our thoughts on the hoodie rating. So that we have to rely on ourselves right now. So Taylor, we just heard from you on the synopsis. So Tim, I will kick it to you for the hoodie rating.
I don't think there's hoodies for regular network defenders involved here. I think it's either neutral or it's goodies for the excellent research that was done here. And I'm actually going to go with goodies. So I'm going to give this report 3 delicious chocolate chip goodies.
Perfect.
With a little bit of cinnamon in them. Fresh out of the oven, warm, chewy. Yeah. chocolate's a little gooey in there. Those are the goodies here. And what is interesting here, there's a number of things. First of all, I think finding out more about how the Great Firewall of China works is interesting in general. And if you live in a country that could see a rise in censorship across the internet, then it's useful to know more about how this works. I have no real comment on what countries might be in that boat right now, but I suspect it's more than one. Seeing the ways that really smart folks are able to probe network infrastructure and the kind of telemetry they can get back from it is really interesting in this paper when you start to get into some of the details. And they were looking like there was traffic that they observed that wasn't just DNS traffic as well, traversing the wall. So it's worth, just from a technical perspective, it's worth having a look at this paper if you're interested in understanding more about what's possible to do in probing infrastructure that you're curious about. So 3 delicious chocolate chip goodies.
Awesome. Taylor, do you feel similarly, or do you want to add some decimal places to your cookies?
We have to eat one bite out of the cookie, I think. Yeah, I think goodies is an appropriate. I was going to go there or ant on a log. Again, I think there's the low chance that, hey, I've got resources over there and maybe something about them has been leaked inadvertently that I didn't want to be kind of known. But more broadly, I think the research is really interesting from how we did this and what does this mean for broader censorship worldwide purposes. So yeah, I'm with goodies. We'll go 3 chocolate chip cookies and then 1/2 of an oatmeal raisin.
Oh, interesting. You know what he's not telling us though, is actually the way that the oatmeal raisin cookie is halved is actually it's sliced edgewise. So there's a top half and a bottom half.
Crispy half and like a gooier half.
Oh, yeah, that could be.
Is how I'm envisioning it.
You only get half of it.
Excellent. Thank you, Taylor, for walking us through that. And again, like we've said, it is a rather dense report, but we are going to share that in our show notes. So if you would like to check out more of that, you are certainly welcome to. But I think this brings us to the final part of the episode, which is we're going to talk about golden guidances. No more grievances, because there's enough grievances that we have right now in the world. And the name is pretty much how it sounds. Like we're going to share a piece of good news and some advice that we might have. Either could be within the industry or not. Doesn't have to be. But yeah, Taylor, since we just heard your summary, we'll start with Tim's golden guidance.
For guidance, I'm going to call out something that we had that came up on internal company chat, which is that if you are a uBlock Origin fan and you're using Chrome, you might want to check. It looks like it may have been disabled. So if that is the case for you, then you'll need to think about what your alternatives might look like if that's something you care about. So check on that. Yeah, and my gold, in keeping with what has been my practice a lot of times recently, I'm just going to talk about something that's more general gold, and it's not InfoSec specific. In fact, it's not even remotely slightly related to InfoSec. Hamilton. I went to it this past week, and I am just so blown away by what Lin-Manuel Miranda was able to accomplish there. It was quite amazing. So check it out if you haven't checked it out. Even if you just want to see the historical perspective and see the story of Alexander Hamilton's rise and ultimate demise in a very unique way, it's worth it from that perspective, but it's just a heck of a lot of fun and a very impressive work of art. So there's my gold.
Awesome.
It's old gold, not to be confused with it. What was that, a beer brand or a cigarette brand or something like that? Anyway, it's old gold, not that kind, but nevertheless, it still shines bright.
For sure. What about you, Taylor?
Just thinking of the beer brand that's old gold.
It's beer. Okay, I couldn't remember if it was
No,
beer.
I don't know.
Or
I don't know if it is.
Oh.
We got last year's beer for you, but
Yeah, that's right.
No, let's see. From a gold perspective, we talked a little bit about Great Britain removing the encryption, or Apple responding to Great Britain and the UK removing end-to-end encryption on iCloud backups located in the UK. One thing that I found mildly heartening was that our new ODNI director, Tulsi Gabbard, came out and said, that's a terrible idea. She came out very much against it, saying that basically is a backdoor for user data and is a clear and egregious violation, would be a clear and egregious violation of American privacy and civil liberties. So we'll take our wins where we can get them. From a guidance perspective, the Great Noise released their 2025 report on exploited devices and their mass internet exploitation report. Plug for that. I always find interesting things there year over year.
This has been a great golden guidance that you guys have shared this week. I love it. So yeah, but that brings us to the end of the episode, unfortunately. But I just want to thank you both for coming and talking about those 2 articles. Thank you to our listeners for coming back week after week. We really appreciate that. And speaking of coming back, you should come back again next week for another all-new episode of Breaking Badness. We will be here, and we hope to see you too. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. And thanks to the official podcast dog, Jojo, for moral support.
That's about all we have for this week. You can find us on Twitter @DomainTools. All of the articles mentioned today will be included in our blog post, which can be found at blog.domaintools.com. Catch us every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time when we publish our podcast and blog. That's it for this week. We'll see you again next week on another episode of Breaking Badness. Until then, remember, don't drink and click.